The black soldier barricaded the door of my bedroom, locking us in for 3 nights while the plantation burned below. I was his captive, a white Southern lady at the mercy of a former slave with a rifle. I should have screamed. I should have fought. But when he forced me to the floor to shield me from the gunfire, his heavy hand on my skin didn't feel like an assault. It felt like a claim. And when my weak, pathetic husband finally returned to rescue me, I looked at him and knew exactly what deadly sin I had to commit to get back to the monster who now owned me. The heat hanging over the veranda of Oak Alley was so dense and oppressive that it felt as though one could slice through it with a knife, severing the thick, humid air that clung to my skin like a second, unwanted garment. I sat motionless in the high-backed wicker chair, my white muslin dress damp against my back, listlessly moving a fan of painted silk in a futile attempt to stir the stagnant atmosphere. Before me, the endless rows of cotton stretched out toward the shimmering horizon, a sea of white and green that usually brought a sense of pride but today offered only a desolate isolation. The silence of the afternoon was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, sawing drone of invisible cicadas and the occasional, distant rumble that sounded like thunder, though the sky above was a polished, relentless blue without a single cloud to promise rain. I knew with a sinking dread in the pit of my stomach that this was not a summer storm gathering strength in the distance. My husband had departed for Richmond 7 days ago, leaving me alone to manage the estate and the servants, whose eyes had grown bolder and whose whispers had turned sharp and secretive in his absence. The tranquility of the afternoon began to fracture not with a noise, but with a vibration that traveled up through the foundation of the house and into the soles of my feet. It was a tremor that started deep within the earth, a low and rhythmic pounding that caused the delicate crystal stemware in the parlor cabinet to shiver and chime a warning. I gripped the arms of my chair, my knuckles turning white, as the distant rumble grew into a distinct, terrifying roar that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the sound of thousands of hooves striking the dry, hard-packed road, a man-made avalanche descending upon my world. I stood up, the fan slipping from my fingers and clattering to the floorboards, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The heavy scent of magnolia and jasmine, usually so sweet, suddenly became cloying and nauseating, mixed with the rising metallic tang of fear that coated my tongue. I wanted to run, to bolt the doors and hide in the cellar, but my legs refused to obey, rooted to the spot by a paralysis born of disbelief and the sudden, crushing realization that the war we had read about in newspapers had finally arrived at my doorstep. A gray haze began to rise above the tree line at the end of the long oak-lined avenue, a choking cloud of dust kicked up by the approaching storm of men and beasts. Within moments, the source of the tremor revealed itself, spilling through the iron gates like a dark, unstoppable floodwaters breaching a dam. They were not the gallant gray-clad defenders of the South that I had prayed to see. Their uniforms were a dark, ominous blue, coated in the grime of the road and the soot of battle. It was the cavalry of the Union, a chaotic mass of blue wool and flashing steel that seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. They rode with a terrifying purpose, their banners limp in the still air, their faces obscured by the shadows of their hat brims. I watched, frozen in horror, as the illusion of my protected life shattered completely, the reality of the invasion pressing in on me with the weight of a nightmare from which I could not wake. The sheer number of them was overwhelming, a swarm of locusts descending to strip the land bare, and I was the sole witness to their arrival, a figure in white standing helpless against the tide of history. The beautifully manicured grounds, the pride of the estate for more than 50 years, were decimated in a matter of seconds as the horses surged forward. I heard the sickening crunch of hooves trampling the prize rosebushes and the tearing sound of the azaleas being ground into the mud. The pastoral silence of the southern afternoon was ripped apart by a cacophony of harsh, shouting voices, the shrill whinnying of agitated horses, and the clatter of sabers against saddles. The air filled with the acrid smell of sweat, leather and horseflesh, overpowering the delicate fragrances of the garden. I saw the servants scattering toward the slave quarters or disappearing into the woods, their fear mirroring my own, leaving me completely abandoned to face the onslaught. One of the riders, an officer with a hard, bearded face, shouted a command that cut through the din, pointing his gloved hand directly at the main house where I stood. It was no longer a home, it was a target, a spoil of war to be claimed by the victors, and I was nothing more than an obstacle to be removed or ignored. The violence escalated as they reached the porch, the heavy wooden steps groaning under the weight of boots that cared nothing for the sanctity of my threshold. I turned and fled inside, the grandiose foyer feeling suddenly like a trap rather than a sanctuary, my petticoats tangling around my legs as I stumbled toward the staircase. Behind me, the heavy oak front door, which had stood barred against the world for generations, shuddered under a massive impact. There was a splintering crash that echoed like a gunshot through the high-ceilinged hallway, followed by the sound of wood giving way and the triumphant roar of the invaders spilling into the hall. The world I had known, built on order and grace, evaporated in that instant, replaced by the raw, chaotic reality of conquest. I reached the landing and looked back for a fleeting second, seeing the sunlight pour into the dark hallway through the broken entrance, illuminating the swirling dust and the dark silhouettes of men pouring in, bringing the war, the filth, and the terror right into the beating heart of my life. My breath tore at my throat like jagged shards of glass as I scrambled up the sweeping curve of the grand staircase, my heavy skirts bunching in my hands and threatening to trip me with every desperate step. The foyer below had dissolved into a cacophony of shouting men and shattering heirlooms, a chaotic symphony of destruction that seemed to nip at my heels like a pack of hounds. I did not look back, for the terror of seeing the invaders swarming through my home was a specter I could not bear to face directly. I reached the landing, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, so violent I feared it might crack the bone. The hallway stretched out before me, usually a corridor of silent, polished dignity, now a tunnel of impending doom. I threw myself toward the sanctuary of my bedchamber, the only room where I still held the illusion of authority, and slammed the heavy oak door shut behind me. My trembling fingers fumbled with the cold iron key, twisting it until the lock clicked, a pitifully small sound against the roaring tide of war that had breached our threshold, a futile gesture of defense against an army that had already swallowed the world outside. I pressed my back against the wood, sliding down until I huddled on the floorboards, my knees drawn up to my chest in a tight, protective knot. The air in the room was still and hot, preserving the scent of lavender and dried roses, a cruel reminder of the peace that had existed only moments ago. But the house itself was screaming. From the floor below, the sounds of the invasion drifted up with terrifying clarity, the guttural, coarse laughter of men drunk on victory and whiskey, the sickening crunch of wood being splintered, and the distinct high-pitched shatter of my mother's porcelain collection meeting the floor. Every crash felt like a physical blow to my own body, a violation of the sanctuary that had sheltered generations of my family. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my hands over my ears, but the sounds were inescapable, vibrating through the very structure of the house, traveling up through the floor joists and into my spine. I was a captain going down with her ship, trapped in the crow's nest while the hull was torn apart by sharks, waiting for the inevitable moment when the water would rise to claim me. Time seemed to distort, stretching and compressing in the suffocating heat of the room. I waited, every muscle coiled tight, listening as the storm of boots moved from the parlor to the library, and then, inevitably, to the staircase. They were coming up. The heavy, rhythmic thud of footsteps ascending the stairs was different from the chaotic scrambling I had heard earlier. These were purposeful, heavy treads that claimed ownership of every step. I held my breath, my lungs burning, as the footsteps moved down the hallway, pausing at the guest rooms, doors being kicked open with brutal efficiency. Then the footsteps stopped directly outside my door. For a heartbeat there was absolute silence, a heavy, pregnant pause that was more terrifying than the noise. I watched the brass handle slowly depress, the mechanism straining against the lock I had engaged. It rattled, metal against metal, a polite inquiry that turned instantly into a demand. When the door did not yield, a heavy weight slammed against the wood, shaking the frame and sending a fine dusting of plaster falling from the ceiling like snow. The second blow was a thunderclap that seemed to split the world in two. The heavy oak, seasoned and strong, groaned in protest, a vertical crack appearing near the latch like a jagged wound. I scrambled backward, crab-walking across the Persian rug until my back hit the foot of the four-poster bed. A gasp trapped in my throat. With a final splintering crash that sent wood chips flying across the room like shrapnel, the door gave way. It swung inward violently, rebounding off the wall, revealing the dark, swirling dust of the corridor beyond. In the gaping wound of the doorway, a figure emerged from the shadows, silhouetted against the dim light of the hall. He was colossal, a mountain of a man whose broad shoulders seemed to fill the entire frame, blocking out the chaos behind him. He wore the dark blue uniform of the Union, the wool stained with the sweat and grime of a long march, brass buttons dull under the layer of dust. But as he stepped into the shaft of light falling from the window, the breath left my body in a rush of pure, unadulterated shock that eclipsed even my fear. The face that looked down at me was not the face of a white northerner, but the dark, gleaming visage of a black man. A colored soldier. The very nightmare that had been whispered about in hushed, terrified tones across every veranda in the South had materialized in my bedroom. My mind reeled, unable to process the inversion of the natural order. A man who, by the laws of my world, should have been in the fields, was standing before me armed with the authority of the United States Army. He held a long Enfield rifle in his hands, not awkwardly, but with an easy, terrifying familiarity, the bayonet fixed and gleaming wickedly. He was motionless for a moment, his chest rising and falling with the exertion of the breech. His eyes, dark and inscrutable, swept the room with a tactical precision, noting the windows, the furniture, and finally landing on me. There was no servitude in that gaze, no lowered head or averted eyes. It was a look of absolute, unyielding equality, perhaps even superiority, that froze the blood in my veins. He did not speak immediately. He simply looked at me, huddled in the wreckage of my dignity, his expression unreadable but devoid of the feral cruelty I had expected. Behind him, in the corridor, the clamor of the other soldiers grew louder. I could see faces peering through the gloom, white faces, flushed with drink and the madness of looting. They were shouting, jeering, pushing forward to see what prize lay behind the locked door. A young corporal with wild eyes and a torn uniform appeared over the black soldier's shoulder, leering into the room, a bottle of my husband's best brandy dangling from his hand. The mob was at the gate, a pack of wolves ready to tear the throat out of the prey their leader had cornered. I pressed myself harder against the bed frame, wishing the floor would open and swallow me whole, waiting for the violence that felt inevitable, the final degradation that would mark the end of my life as I knew it. But the violence did not come from him. The black soldier did not step aside to let the others in. Instead, he turned his back to me, facing the men in the hallway. His movement was fluid and sharp. He shifted the rifle, bringing the butt down hard on the floorboards with a crack that cut through the laughter outside. He barked a command, his voice deep, resonant, and laced with a steel that brokered no argument. It was a tone of command I had only ever heard from my husband or father, yet here it rolled off his tongue with practiced authority. He spoke rapidly, his words sharp and guttural, gesturing with the barrel of his rifle for the men to back away. I could not make out the exact words through the ringing in my ears, but the effect was immediate. The white soldiers, the conquerors, hesitated. There was a moment of tension, a silent standoff where the racial hierarchy of the South collided with the military hierarchy of the North, and for a breathless second, I thought they might shoot him. The soldier in the doorway did not flinch. He racked the bolt of his rifle, the metallic clack-clack echoing loudly in the sudden quiet. It was a universal language, a promise of immediate violence that transcended rank or race. He stood like a monolith, his massive frame effectively walling off my room from the rest of the house. The leering corporal spat on the floor but took a step back, muttering a curse that was lost in the shuffling of boots. Slowly, grudgingly, the mob began to recede, their interest waning in the face of such lethal obstinacy. They drifted away like a receding tide, drawn back to the easier pickings of the silver chest and the wine cellar downstairs. The sounds of their boots retreated down the hall, leaving a heavy ringing silence in their wake. The soldier watched them go, his posture rigid, not relaxing a single muscle until the corridor was empty of immediate threats. Only then did he turn back to me. He did not offer a hand to help me up, nor did he offer words of comfort. He looked at me with a strange, detached assessment, as if I were a piece of complex machinery he had been tasked to guard but not to touch. He stepped fully into the room, crossing the threshold that no man other than my husband had ever crossed. The psychological violation was profound, yet it was overlaid with a confusing, desperate sense of relief. He was an invader, yes, but he had just driven back the wolves. He looked at the broken door, the splintered wood hanging from the hinges, and shook his head slightly, a gesture of almost domestic annoyance at the waist. Then, he slung his rifle over his shoulder, the leather strap straining against the thick muscle of his chest, and walked toward the heavy mahogany dresser that stood against the far wall. Without a word, he gripped the side of the dresser. It was a massive piece of furniture, solid wood filled with linens, something two house slaves usually struggled to move during spring cleaning. He grunted low in his throat, the cords of his neck standing out like cables, and shoved it. The wood screeched against the floorboards, a high-pitched protest that set my teeth on edge. He pushed it with a relentless, inexorable strength until it slid across the room and slammed against the broken door, effectively sealing us inside. The barrier was crude but effective. No one could enter without pushing through hundreds of pounds of solid mahogany. He checked the positioning, giving it one final shove to ensure it was wedged tight, then turned his back on the barricade. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thinner. He had locked the world out, but he had also locked us in together. He exhaled slowly, a long breath that seemed to carry the weight of the march and the battle. He walked to the window, peering out through the lace curtains at the yard below, checking the perimeter with the vigilance of a sentry. I watched him paralyzed, my mind struggling to categorize him. He was not a servant. He was not a guest. He was a captor who had appointed himself my warden. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy, filled only by the sound of his breathing and the distant, muffled destruction of my home. I realized then, with a clarity that was as cold as ice water, that the power dynamic of my entire life had been obliterated. I was no longer the mistress of Oak Alley. I was merely a woman in a room with a man who possessed the strength to crush me, and for the first time in my life, my safety depended not on my station or my name, but on the whim of a former slave who held the only weapon in the room. Night descended upon the plantation not as a soothing blanket to signal the end of labor, but as a suffocating shroud that trapped the heat and the horror of the day within the walls of the house. The transformation of my home was complete. What had been a sanctuary of refinement and quiet order was now a raucous barracks, vibrating with the coarse energy of occupying troops. Darkness claimed the corners of the room, heavy and absolute, broken only by the pale, ghostly illumination of the moon filtering through the window panes. Outside, the world had been turned upside down. The pristine lawns, usually silent save for the crickets, were now alive with the flickering orange glow of campfires. I could hear the crackle of dry wood. My father's antique mahogany chairs, I suspected with a sickening lurch of my stomach, being fed to the flames to roast stolen livestock. The smoke drifted up, seeping through the cracks in the window frames, carrying with it the scent of burning varnish, roasting meat, and the acrid tang of unwashed bodies, a smell that invaded my lungs and made me gag silently in the gloom. Below me, the house groaned under the weight of the celebration. The soldiers were singing, their voices rising in a discordant, drunken chorus that mocked the elegance of the architecture that contained them. They sang songs of the Union, boisterous ballads of victory, and marching that felt like physical blows against the floorboards beneath my feet. Every stomp of a heavy boot, every shattered bottle, vibrated up through the frame of the house and into my own body, keeping my nerves stretched to the breaking point. I sat huddled in the wingback chair where I had taken refuge hours ago, my muscles locked in a painful rigor of tension. I was terrified to move, terrified that the slightest creak of the furniture would draw attention to my presence, even though I knew the man guarding the door was fully aware of every breath I took. The isolation was profound. I was a prisoner in my own bedroom, separated from the anarchy downstairs by nothing more than a barricaded door and the silent, imposing figure of the man who had claimed this space as his watchtower. The soldier sat by the window, a dark silhouette cut out against the moonlight. He had not moved for what felt like hours. He sat with a stillness that was unnatural, a predatory patience that contrasted sharply with the chaotic movement of the men below. He was watching the yard, his rifle leaning against the sill within easy reach, his posture relaxed yet alert. I watched him through the gloom, my eyes adjusting to the low light until I could make out the curve of his shoulders and the profile of his face. He seemed carved from obsidian, a permanent fixture in the room that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. He paid me no mind, his attention fixed on the perimeter, yet his presence filled the room so completely that I felt there was barely enough air left for me to breathe. He was the warden and I was the inmate, and in the silence between the songs downstairs, the shift in power was absolute and undeniable. As the night deepened, The physical demands of my body began to compete with my terror. Hunger was a dull ache in my stomach, but thirst was a sharp, clawing desperation in my throat. I had not eaten or drunk anything since the midday meal, which seemed like a lifetime ago in a different era. My tongue felt swollen, sticking to the roof of my mouth, and my lips were cracked and dry. I stared at the wash basin in the corner, knowing there was water in the pitcher, but the distance across the room felt like miles of open battlefield. To reach it, I would have to stand, to move, to draw his gaze. I swallowed dryly, the sound seeming deafening in the stillness. I tried to moisten my lips, but there was no moisture to be found. The deprivation stripped away layers of my civility, leaving a raw, animalistic need that began to eclipse my fear of the man sitting just a few feet away. I was a lady of the South, raised to endure hardships with grace, but this was a primal suffering that education had not prepared me for. Suddenly, the silhouette at the window shifted. The movement was sudden and silent, causing my heart to leap into my throat. The soldier turned his head, breaking his vigil over the yard, and looked into the dark recesses of the room where I sat curled in the chair. I froze, holding my breath, my hands gripping the armrest so hard my fingernails dug into the upholstery. He stood up, his boots making a soft thud on the rug, and the sheer size of him seemed to expand in the confined space. He picked up something from the floor, his haversack, and began to rummage through it. The sound of canvas and metal clinking together was loud in the quiet room. I pressed myself back into the chair, making myself as small as possible, certain that the moment of violence I had been dreading was finally at hand. I closed my eyes, waiting for a rough hand to grab me, for the inevitable punishment that came to the conquered. But the blow did not come. Instead, I heard the heavy footsteps approach and stop directly in front of me. I opened my eyes, looking up into the towering shadow that loomed over me. The moonlight caught the side of his face, revealing an expression that was devoid of malice but filled with a serious intent. He did not speak. He simply reached out a hand. In it he held a battered metal canteen, the strap dangling like a pendulum. In his other hand he held a piece of hard, square biscuit, hardtack, the rations of the enemy. I stared at the offering, my mind struggling to process the gesture. It was not an act of servitude. He did not bow or offer it on a tray. He held it out with the expectation that I would take it, a command disguised as charity. My thirst overruled my pride. Slowly, with trembling hands, I reached out to accept the canteen. Our fingers brushed as the transfer was made. The contact was electric, a jolt that ran up my arm and settled deep in my chest. His hand was enormous, the skin rough and calloused like worn leather, radiating a dry, intense heat that seemed to sear my cold, clammy skin. It was the hand of a man who had worked the earth, who had wielded tools and weapons, a hand that knew the texture of labor and violence. In that fleeting second of connection, the reality of our positions was laid bare. There was no deference in his touch, no apology for his roughness. It was a tactile declaration of fact. He was the provider, the strong one, the one with the resources. I was the dependent, the weak one, the one with nothing. I pulled the canteen away, clutching it to my chest like a precious jewel, the warmth of his hand still ghosting on my fingertips. I uncorked the flask, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the cap. The smell of the water was metallic and stale, but as I lifted it to my lips and drank, it tasted like the sweetest nectar I had ever known. I drank greedily, water spilling down my chin and soaking the lace of my collar, unconcerned with the mess. I tore at the hard biscuit with my teeth, the dry, tasteless flour turning to paste in my mouth, but I swallowed it with gratitude. Throughout this display of desperate hunger, I could feel his eyes on me. I looked up over the rim of the canteen, meeting his gaze. He had not moved back to the window. He stood there watching me eat and drink, his arms crossed over his chest. The moonlight was brighter now, washing over him, and for the first time, I saw him not as a symbol of the invasion, but as a man made of flesh, blood, and history. The silver light traced the lines of his neck, illuminating the raised, keloid scars that vanished beneath the collar of his uniform. They were old marks, thick and ropey, the brutal signature of a whip wielded in a time that suddenly felt ancient. I stared at them, fascinated and horrified. These were the brands of chattel, the physical evidence of the system my family had fought to preserve. Yet, Overlaid on this scarred skin was the dark blue wool of the United States Army, with brass buttons that gleamed softly. The contrast was jarring, the marks of the slave and the uniform of the liberator coexisting on the same body. He saw me looking at the scars. He did not cover them or turn away in shame. Instead, he tilted his chin slightly, exposing them further, a silent challenge that dared me to acknowledge the brutality that had forged him. His gaze moved from the canteen to my face and held me there. I had grown up surrounded by black faces, servants, field hands, nurses, but I had never been looked at like this. Slaves looked down or past you or through you, veiling their thoughts behind a mask of obedient vacuity. This man looked directly into me. His eyes were dark and intelligent, stripping away the layers of my social standing, until I was just a woman sitting in the dark. There was a flicker of something in his expression that made my breath catch. Not hatred, though he had every right to it, and not subservience. It was a mix of cold contempt for the luxury that surrounded me, the useless velvet and silk that offered no protection, and a deep primal curiosity. He was assessing me, not as a mistress or a lady, but as a female creature that had fallen under his protection and control. I lowered the canteen, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand, unable to look away from him. The silence between us was thick with unspoken things. I realized with a sudden dizzying clarity that I was seeing something I had never encountered in the drawing rooms of Richmond or the ballrooms of Charleston. The men I knew, my husband, his friends, were bound by endless codes of conduct, by chivalry and reputation and the fragile constructs of society. Their power was granted by their name and their money. This man's power was entirely his own. It radiated from his broad shoulders, from his calloused hands, from the rifle he handled with such ease. It was a raw, unfiltered potency that did not ask for permission. He did not need to shout or posture. His mere existence in this room, standing over me while I ate his food, was a demonstration of a strength that rendered my husband's world obsolete. A strange, confusing heat rose in my cheeks, unrelated to the temperature of the room. Fear was still there, sharp and cold, but it was now laced with a thread of something else, acknowledgement. I was in the presence of a predator, yes, but a predator who had chosen, for reasons I could not fathom, to keep the other wolves at bay. He watched me finish the cracker, his expression unreadable, and I felt a sudden shameful desire to please him, to show him that I was grateful, that I submitted to the new law he represented. It was a survival instinct, I told myself, a necessary capitulation to the man holding the gun. But as he reached out to take the empty canteen back, and our fingers brushed once more, the shiver that went through me had nothing to do with the night air. It was the terrifying, exhilarating recognition of absolute power, and the realization that for the first time in my life, I was completely, utterly at the mercy of a man who owed me nothing. He capped the canteen and hooked it back onto his belt, the metallic click sounding like a period at the end of a sentence. He did not smile. He did not say, "You're welcome." He simply turned on his heel, his heavy boots silent on the plush rug, and returned to his post at the window. He picked up his rifle, checking the action with a fluid motion, and resumed his watch over the burning yard. I sat back in the chair, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The taste of the stale water lingered on my tongue, a tangible link between us. I pulled my legs up, wrapping my arms around my knees, and watched his broad back blocking out the moonlight. The fear was changing, mutating into a dark, heavy dependency. I was no longer just waiting for the morning. I was waiting for him to look at me again. The world outside had burned away, leaving only the dark room, the silence, and the soldier who had conquered not just the house, but the very air I breathed. The second night of the occupation descended with a weight that felt physically crushing, a suffocating blanket of humidity and dread that was far worse than the initial shock of the first day. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the initial invasion had long since evaporated, leaving behind a brittle, exhausting terror that frayed my nerves with every passing second. The house, once a fortress of silence and decorum, now felt like a living thing in pain, its timbers groaning under the alien presence of the soldiers below and the heavy, brooding atmosphere of the war that surrounded us. I sat in the same high-back chair, my body aching from the rigidity of my posture, my eyes straining into the darkness. The soldier was there, of course, a permanent shadow against the wall, his presence a constant reminder that my autonomy had been suspended. He had not slept, as far as I could tell. He remained a vigilant statue carved from midnight and resolve, his attention divided between the prisoner in the chair and the potential threats lurking in the gloom beyond the window panes. The uneasy silence was shattered not by a scream, but by a sudden sharp crack that sounded like a dry branch snapping, only 1,000 times louder. It came from the west, near the edge of the creek, followed almost instantly by a ragged volley of answering fire that tore through the humid night air. The war, which had seemed to be pausing for breath, had suddenly flared back into violence just beyond the property line. The reaction of the house was immediate. The glass in the tall French windows rattled violently in their frames, a high-pitched shivering sound that mimicked the chattering of teeth. Before I could even draw a breath to scream, the shadow against the wall detached itself and moved with a terrifying blurred speed. I had no time to process the threat, no time to stand or run. One moment I was sitting in the chair, and in the next, a hand of iron clamped onto my arm, the grip bruising and undeniable, yanking me downward with a force that sent the chair skittering across the floorboards. He did not speak, nor did he offer a gentleman's apology for the roughness of his handling. He dragged me down from the pedestal of my social station and onto the dusty Persian rug, flattening me against the floor as a second volley of gunfire erupted, much closer this time. The world tilted on its axis, the vertical order of my life collapsing into a horizontal desperation. He went down with me, his massive frame covering mine, effectively shielding my body with his own. It was a tactical maneuver, a calculated decision to place his expendable flesh between the potential bullet and the prize he was guarding, but the intimacy of the action was shattering. We lay there in the dark, the heavy wool of his uniform scratching against the delicate muslin of my dress, the hard floor digging into my shoulder blades. The abstract concept of the enemy had suddenly become a physical reality pressing the air from my lungs, a heavy living weight that pinned me to the earth and refused to let me move. The darkness on the floor was absolute, a sensory deprivation that heightened every other perception to an agonizing degree. Robbed of my sight, my sense of smell became acute, overwhelming me with the raw, unfiltered reality of the man lying atop me. The delicate, soothing scent of the lavender sachets I sewed into my skirts, the smell of my mother, of the parlor of civilization, was instantly obliterated. In its place came a wave of scents that were foreign, aggressive, and undeniably masculine. The sharp, metallic tang of gunpowder clung to his clothes like a second skin, mixed with the biting, acrid odor of cheap tobacco and the heavy, musk-like smell of old sweat and leather. It was the smell of the camps, of the march, of a life lived in the mud and the blood, and it invaded my nostrils, filling my head until I was dizzy with it. It was a violation of my personal space so profound that it felt like an assault, yet in that terrified moment it was also the smell of survival. I lay frozen, my cheek pressed against the rough weave of the carpet, feeling the rise and fall of his chest against my side. The contrast between our internal states was stark and terrifying. My own heart was a frantic bird battering itself against the cage of my ribs, fluttering with a chaotic hummingbird rhythm that I was sure he could feel through the layers of our clothing. But as I lay there, trapped beneath his weight, I became aware of the steady, powerful thumping of his own heart. It beat with a slow, rhythmic cadence, a heavy drum that showed no sign of fear or panic. It was the heartbeat of a creature accustomed to the hunt, a biological machine built for endurance and violence. That slow, steady rhythm began to have a strange, hypnotic effect on me, a grounding force in a world that was spinning out of control. He was not afraid, and because he was not afraid, the blind panic that threatened to consume me began to recede, replaced by a hyper-aware state of suspension. The gunfire outside sputtered and died down, replaced by the shouting of men and the distant galloping of horses, but he did not move. The immediate danger had passed, yet he kept me pinned to the floor, his body shielding mine from a threat that was no longer imminent. It was in this lingering moment that the nature of the contact shifted. His arm was draped heavy across my shoulders, his hand resting near my neck. It had started as a restraint, a way to keep me low and safe, but now, in the quiet that followed the violence, his fingers flexed. His hand tightened on my shoulder, the wide, callous palm gripping the curve of my bone with a pressure that was just on the edge of pain. It was not a violent squeeze but a possessive one. It was a silent assertion of dominion, A physical reminder that while the bullets outside might miss me, I was firmly within his grasp. I should have flinched. I should have pulled away, scrambled backward, and demanded he release me. Every lesson of my upbringing, every rule of propriety and race that had been drilled into me since birth, screamed that this contact was an abomination. But I did not move. I lay still, my breath catching in my throat, and realized with a jolt of horror that I did not want him to move. In the chaos that had swallowed my life, where the laws of the Confederacy had crumbled into dust and my husband was a distant, impotent memory, this man's weight was the only constant thing left in the universe. He was a wall of granite in a hurricane. The boundaries of the permissible had been erased by the artillery fire, leaving us in a primal lawless space where the only currency was strength. By not pulling away, by allowing his hand to remain on my shoulder, I was crossing a line from which there could be no return. I shifted slightly, not to escape, but to alleviate the pressure on my arm, and the movement brought us even closer. The friction of our bodies in the dark sent a jolt of static electricity through my nerves that had nothing to do with fear. I could feel the heat radiating from him, a furnace that warmed the chill of the floorboards. His head was turned towards the window, but as I settled, he turned his face towards me. I couldn't see his eyes in the pitch black, but I could feel his breath. It washed over the exposed skin of my neck, hot and rhythmic, raising gooseflesh that shivered down my spine. It was an intimacy more profound than any kiss I had ever received in a ballroom. It was the shared breath of the foxhole, the commingling of life forces in the face of death. The taboo nature of it, the sheer impossibility of a black soldier holding the mistress of the plantation in the dark, added a jagged, dangerous edge to the sensation that made my head swim. A silent, unspoken pact was formed in the darkness of that room, sealed not with signatures or handshakes, but with the mingling of breath and the acceptance of weight. He knew I was awake. He knew I was not pulling away. He tested the boundaries of his new authority, his hand sliding imperceptibly upwards, his thumb brushing the hollow of my throat where my pulse hammered against the skin. He was measuring the life in me, holding my fragility in his hand, understanding that he could crush it or protect it with equal ease. And God help me, I leaned into the touch. I sought the protection of the monster to save me from the other monsters outside. I surrendered the illusion of my command and accepted my role as the protected, the property, the prize. It was a surrender that went deeper than politics. It was a biological concession to the superior force. We lay there for what felt like an eternity, the silence of the room heavy with the unsaid. The sounds from downstairs, the drunken singing, the breaking glass, seemed to come from a different world miles away. Here, on the floor, the universe had shrunk to the few inches between us. I realized that the fear I had felt for 2 days had transmuted into a strange, dark dependency. I needed his strength. I needed the violence he was capable of because without it I was nothing but prey. The realization was humiliating, yet strangely liberating. I closed my eyes, inhaling the scent of gunpowder and sweat that was now the scent of my safety, and let my body go limp against the floor, signaling my total and absolute submission to the man who held me in the dark. He did not speak, but I felt his body relax slightly, the tension of the guardian easing into the confidence of the possessor. The night wore on, but I was no longer waiting for the dawn. I was existing entirely in the shadow he cast. The bugle call that shattered the fragile pre-dawn silence was not the melodic, mournful sound I had associated with parades and ceremonies in the days before the war. It was a harsh, brassy shriek that cut through the humid air like a jagged blade. A command that brooked no delay or argument. It roused me from a shallow, fitful doze, my heart instantly hammering against my ribs as the reality of the room flooded back into my consciousness. The gray light of early morning was just beginning to bleed through the lace curtains, turning the furniture into ghostly, indistinct shapes. The man who had been the architect of my terror and my survival was already moving. He rose from his vigil by the window with a fluid, silent efficiency that spoke of a life lived on the edge of violence. There was no hesitation in his movements, no grogginess of sleep. He simply transitioned from stillness to action as if a switch had been thrown inside him. I pulled my knees to my chest, watching him through the gloom, feeling a sudden, inexplicable tightening in my chest that had nothing to do with fear. He stood in the center of the room, a towering shadow against the paling window, and began to assemble the accoutrements of his trade. He tightened the leather belt around his waist, the brass buckle catching a stray gleam of light, and adjusted the heavy cartridge box that hung at his hip. Every motion was precise, practiced, and utterly impersonal. He checked his rifle, running his large, calloused hands over the wood and steel with a familiarity that was almost tender, ensuring the mechanism was clear and the bayonet was secure. I watched the play of muscles in his back and shoulders as he moved, the sheer physical power of him undeniable even in the mundane act of dressing. He did not look at me while he prepared. He was already mentally transitioning away from this room, away from the strange suspended reality we had inhabited for the last 3 days, and back into the machine of the Union Army. I felt a sudden sharp pang of loss, not of affection, but of the anchor he had become. For 72 hours, his presence had been the only law in my world. Now that law was packing up to leave. When he was fully equipped, the transformation was complete. He was no longer the silent guardian of the bedroom. He was a soldier of the United States, a cog in the wheel of the conquering force. He turned slowly and walked toward the barricade he had erected, the heavy mahogany dresser that had sealed us off from the madness of the house. With a grunt of exertion that vibrated low in his chest, he shoved the heavy furniture aside, the wood screeching against the floorboards in a final piercing protest. The sound was like a seal breaking, marking the end of the siege. He opened the shattered door, revealing the dark, empty corridor beyond. The noise from downstairs had ceased. The drunken songs and the crashing of glass were gone, replaced by the shouted orders of sergeants and the stamping of horses in the yard. The regiment was moving out. The occupation was over. And I was about to be left behind in the wreckage. He paused in the doorway, his hand resting on the splintered frame. For a long, breathless moment he did not move. Then slowly he turned his head and looked back at me. It was the first time that morning he had acknowledged my existence. His face was obscured by the shadows of the hall, but his eyes caught the light, dark and impenetrable. There were no words of farewell, no apologies for the intrusion, no promises to return when the war was won. Those were the pleasantries of my world, the lies men told women in parlors. In his world there was only the truth of the moment. His gaze was heavy, weighing me one last time. In that look I saw a complex tapestry of emotions, a flicker of triumph, the satisfaction of a man who has walked into the lion's den and walked out unscathed, a cold, hard assessment of my vulnerability, and perhaps buried deep a trace of regret. Not for the destruction, but for the end of the strange, silent intimacy that had grown in the dark. Then, without a nod or a wave, he turned and stepped into the hallway. The sound of his heavy boots receded down the corridor, a steady, rhythmic thudding that grew fainter with every step until it was swallowed by the general commotion of the departure outside. He left the door wide open. It was a final symbolic gesture. The barrier was gone. The protection was gone. I was exposed to the world again, but the world had changed irrevocably. I sat in the chair for a long time, staring at the empty doorway, listening to the sounds of the army withdrawing. The rumble of wagons, the clatter of hooves, the shouting of men. It all faded slowly, like a receding tide, rolling away down the oak-lined avenue and leaving a silence in its wake that was more terrifying than the noise had ever been. It was a silence that screamed of abandonment, a void that I now had to fill with the shattered remnants of my former life. The sun rose higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing the full extent of the devastation. I finally summoned the strength to stand, my legs trembling as I walked to the window. The yard was a churning sea of mud and trampled grass. The fences were gone, used for firewood. The livestock was gone, but the blue uniforms were gone too. The silence that settled over the plantation was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on the roof. It was not the peaceful quiet of a summer morning. It was the stunned, ringing silence of a battlefield after the guns have fallen cold. I wandered out into the hallway, stepping over debris, my movements dreamlike and detached. The house felt alien, a corpse of a building that had been violated and left to rot. I was a ghost haunting my own life, drifting through rooms that no longer held any meaning for me. An hour passed, or perhaps 2. Time had lost its structure. Then the sound of wheels on gravel broke the stillness. It was not the thunderous approach of cavalry, but the slow, laboring creak of a single wagon. I went to the front porch, stepping carefully over the broken glass of the fanlight that lay scattered across the entryway. A solitary buckboard wagon was making its way up the drive, pulled by a mule that looked as exhausted as the land itself. Slumped on the bench seat, holding the reins with a slack, indifferent grip, was my husband. I watched him approach with a strange sense of detachment, as if I were looking at a stranger or a distant relative I hadn't seen in years. He did not look like the dashing officer who had ridden off to Richmond in a cloud of patriotic fervor. He looked small. He looked broken. And worst of all, he looked utterly ordinary. He pulled the wagon to a halt near the ruined flower beds, struggling to climb down. His uniform, once tailored to perfection, hung on his frame like a sack, stained with mud and grease. His face was gray, covered in a week's worth of patchy stubble, and his eyes darted nervously around the yard, not scanning for threats like the soldier, but looking for lost possessions. He wore his left arm in a sling made from a dirty scarf, and he moved with a pronounced limp that seemed exaggerated, a theatrical display of his suffering. He didn't rush to the steps to call my name. He didn't draw a weapon to defend his home. Instead, he stood by the wagon, kicking at a pile of horse manure left by the Union cavalry, and let out a high whining curse that sounded pathetic in the vast, empty silence of the morning. I stood at the top of the stairs looking down at him, waiting for a spark of emotion, relief, love, even anger. I felt nothing. He finally looked up and saw me. There was no rush of embrace, no desperate inquiry about my safety or my honor. His eyes swept over me and then immediately went past me, to the broken door, the smashed windows, the ruin of his estate. "They're gone," he called out, his voice thin and cracking, lacking any of the deep, resonant timbre that I had listened to for the last 3 nights. "Did they take the horses? Damn it, did they find the silver?" He hobbled up the steps, pushing past me without touching me, his breath smelling of stale brandy and fear. He was a whirlwind of anxious energy, vibrating with a frantic, impotent rage that felt childish and exhausting. I followed him into the house, watching as he moved from room to room. He was counting. He was calculating. He wept over a smashed vase in the hallway, his shoulders shaking with a grief that seemed entirely disproportionate to the object's value. He railed against the cowardly deserters, who had left his unit, blaming them for his own retreat. He complained about the roads, about the food, about the incompetence of his commanders, his voice rising in a shrill litany of grievances. "Look at this," he shrieked, pointing to a slash in the portrait of his grandfather. "Animals. Savages. Do you know how much this cost to restore?" He was completely blind to the reality of what had happened in this house. He saw only the loss of things, the insult to his wallet and his pride. He did not ask how I had survived. He did not ask if I had been hurt. He assumed, in his boundless narcissism, that his property damage was the greatest tragedy of the war. As I watched him fluttering around the wreckage of the parlor, picking up shards of china and trying to fit them back together with trembling hands, a wave of physical nausea washed over me. It started in my stomach and rose to my throat, a bitter bile of revulsion. He looked so incredibly weak. His hands were soft and pale, shaking not from adrenaline but from nerves. His complaints were the tantrums of a spoiled child who had his toys broken. I compared him, inevitably, to the man who had just left. I thought of the soldier's stillness, his absolute control, the way he had moved the dresser with a single shove, the way his hand had felt on my shoulder, heavy, dangerous, and real. That man had been a force of nature, a being of blood and iron who commanded the space he occupied. My husband was a paper doll, fluttering in the wind, substantial only in his own mind. The contrast was so sharp it was blinding. The husband I had deferred to, the man whose word had been law in this house, was a fiction I had agreed to believe in. The war had stripped away the costume, revealing the frightened, ineffectual little man beneath the gray wool. He was ranting now about writing a letter to the governor, about demanding compensation, about how he would make the Yankees pay after the victory. The delusion was pathetic. He stood there, holding the handle of a broken teacup, his face flushed with a petty, impotent fury, and I realized with a cold, terrifying clarity that I despised him. He was not a protector. He was not a partner. He was a burden. He was a remnant of a world that had burned down 3 nights ago, and he was too stupid to realize he was standing in the ashes. He finally turned to me, sensing my silence, looking for validation of his outrage. "Well?" he demanded, his voice petulant. "Don't just stand there like a statue. Help me look for the ledger. If they took the ledger, we'll never be able to prove our losses." He gestured vaguely at the chaos, expecting me to snap into my role as the dutiful, efficient wife. He wanted me to order the invisible servants to clean the mess, to soothe his ego, to make his world right again. He looked at me with those watery, pale eyes, and for the first time, I saw him not as the master of Oak Alley, but as an intruder. He was clutter. He was noise. He was an obstacle. The dark, silent giant who had held my life in his hands had taken everything of value with him when he left, leaving me with this hollow shell of a man who thought he still owned me. I looked at his injured arm, the sling tied clumsily around his neck. It wasn't a wound of valor. He had probably fallen off a horse or tripped in the dark. There was no glory in him, no strength. The revulsion I felt was absolute, a physical rejection of his proximity. I took a step back, my skin crawling at the thought of him touching me, of him trying to reclaim his marital rights in the bed where the soldier had stood guard. The very air around him seemed stale, smelling of defeat and decay. I realized then that the war had not just destroyed the plantation, it had destroyed the illusion of my marriage. I had seen what true power looked like, what true survival required, and this whimpering creature before me possessed neither. He was dead to me, a ghost rattling chains in a house that no longer belonged to him, and as he continued to prattle on about the price of cotton, I felt the cold, hard seed of a plan beginning to take root in the darkness of my heart. The evening sun began to bleed out over the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the ruins of the parlor that looked like grasping fingers stretching across the floorboards. The golden hour, usually a time of serenity at the plantation, now served only to highlight the absolute devastation of my world. The light caught the jagged edges of broken glass and the stuffing spilling from the slashed upholstery of the settee. My husband sat in the only wingback chair that had miraculously survived the occupation, a throne of velvet surrounded by a kingdom of debris. He had been talking for hours, a ceaseless, droning monologue of grievances that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen out of the room. He complained of the heat, of the dust, of the incompetence of his commanders, and the insolence of the Yankees. He did not speak of the future, or of rebuilding, or of us. He spoke only of what he was owed and how unjustly he had been treated, his voice a thin, reedy sound that grated against my nerves like a bow saw on wet wood. I stood by the window, watching the darkness gather in the corners of the room, and realized with a cold, dispassionate clarity that I could not endure another sunrise in his presence. He was not a man. He was a ghost of a dead era, a noisy, demanding poltergeist haunting a house that had already been claimed by a stronger power. "My nerves are shot," he declared, his voice rising in a petulant whine that snapped my attention back to him. He rubbed his temples with his pale, trembling fingers, wincing as if the very air were assaulting him. "I cannot sleep with this silence. It's too loud. The silence is too loud, do you understand? I need something to settle me. A draft. Bring me a draft." He gestured vaguely toward the hallway, treating me with the distracted impatience one might show a slow-witted servant. He did not look at me. He looked through me, seeing only a functionary whose sole purpose was to facilitate his comfort. The contrast was physically painful. I closed my eyes for a second and saw the dark, silent soldier who had sat in this room for 3 nights. A man who had asked for nothing, who had commanded the space with a stillness that was more powerful than any shout. That man had been a monolith. This man was a pile of dry leaves rattling in the wind. "Yes," I said softly, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "I will get you something to help you sleep." I turned and walked out of the parlor, my skirts sweeping over the debris-strewn floor with a soft hiss. I moved through the darkening hallway toward the study, the one room the soldiers had tossed but not burned. The air in the house was stagnant, holding the heat of the day and the lingering phantom scents of the uninvited guests, tobacco, sweat, and horseflesh, which now seemed preferable to the scent of my husband's stale cologne. I entered the study and went to the heavy oak desk. It had been overturned, papers scattered everywhere like snow, but the secret compartment behind the wainscoting remained undiscovered. I pressed the hidden latch, and the panel clicked open. Inside, untouched by the chaos of the war, was the small private apothecary my father had kept for emergencies. I reached in, my hand steady, and bypassed the smelling salts and the quinine. My fingers closed around a dark blue glass bottle, heavy and cold. Laudanum, the tincture of opium, the thick, sweet syrup of oblivion. I held it up to the dying light, the liquid inside sloshing sluggishly, promising a sleep deep enough to drown all complaints. I found a crystal tumbler that had rolled under the bookcase, miraculously unbroken, and wiped the dust from it with the hem of my apron. I poured a generous measure of my husband's brandy, the last of a bottle I had found hidden in the pantry, the amber liquid glinting in the gloom. Then I unstoppered the blue bottle. The smell of the opium was heavy and medicinal, a scent of sickness and silence. I did not count the drops. I did not measure with a spoon. I tilted the bottle and let the dark, viscous fluid pour into the brandy, watching it swirl and cloud the alcohol like ink dropped into water. It was a lethal dose, enough to stop the heart of a draft horse, let alone a man weakened by fear and exhaustion. I swirled the glass gently, watching the two liquids merge into a single dark deliverer of peace. There was no hesitation in my movements, no trembling of the hand. I felt a profound icy calm, a sense of rightness that I had never felt in church. I was not committing a crime. I was correcting a mistake. I was pruning a withered branch so the tree might survive. I walked back into the parlor, the glass held steady in my hand. I paused in the doorway to compose my features, summoning the lessons I had learned in the finishing school in Charleston so many years ago. I smoothed my brow, softened my mouth, and painted on a mask of solicitous concern. It was the face of the dutiful Southern wife, the angel of the hearth, a role I had played until it felt like a suffocating second skin. I stepped into the room, the floorboards creaking softly under my feet. "Here," I said, my voice dripping with a honeyed sweetness that felt toxic on my tongue. "This will help you rest. It is strong, but you need the sleep." I held the glass out to him. He looked up, his eyes watery and ungrateful, and snatched the glass from my hand without a word of thanks. He brought it to his nose, sniffing it suspiciously, but the strong aroma of the brandy masked the bitter metallic tang of the poison. His greed and his desperation to escape his own misery did the rest. He drank it down in one long, greedy swallow, his throat working convulsively as he drained the glass to the dregs. He gasped as he lowered the glass, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, a splash of the dark liquid staining his uniform collar. "Bitter," he muttered, making a face. "Everything is bitter these days." He handed the glass back to me, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. "Go on now. Let me be. I need to close my eyes." He settled back into the chair, adjusting his sling, shifting his weight until he found a position of comfort. I retreated to the shadows near the fireplace, standing as still as the soldier had stood, and waited. It did not take long. The drug hit his system with the force of a hammer. His eyelids grew heavy, drooping over his pale eyes. His head lolled forward, then jerked back, then settled against the velvet wing of the chair. His breathing deepened, becoming heavy and wet, the sound of a man sliding down a dark slope into unconsciousness. The snoring began a few minutes later, a ragged, hitching sound that filled the room. It was an ugly sound, the sound of a body struggling against the weight of the narcotic. I watched him without blinking. I felt no pity, no surge of affection for the years we had shared. Those years felt like a story told about someone else, a dull, colorless narrative that had finally reached its conclusion. I watched his chest rise and fall, the rhythm becoming slower, more erratic. The pauses between breaths grew longer, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 20. I counted them in my head, marking the time. The snoring stopped, replaced by shallow, gasping breaths that barely moved the fabric of his tunic. And then finally there was silence. It was not the loud silence he had complained of. It was a profound, absolute stillness, the silence of an empty vessel. The room seemed to exhale, relieved of his presence. The shadows swallowed him up, claiming him as part of the wreckage. I walked over to the chair and looked down at him. He looked small and crumpled, like a puppet whose strings had been cut. I reached out and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his neck, searching for the flutter of life. His skin was warm, but beneath it there was nothing. No pulse. No rhythm. The engine had stopped. I waited for the guilt to strike me, for the horror of what I had done to bring me to my knees. But it did not come. Instead, I felt a lightness, a buoyancy, as if a heavy stone had been cut from around my neck. I was a widow. I was a murderess. And for the first time in my life I was free. I wiped my fingers on my skirt, cleansing myself of the final contact, and turned away from the corpse. He was no longer my husband. He was just another casualty of a war that destroyed everything it touched. He belonged to the past now, and I had no intention of lingering there with him. I moved quickly then, driven by a new sharp purpose. I went upstairs to the bedroom, the room where the door still hung off its hinges, and retrieved the small velvet sack I had hidden inside the hollow bedpost before the soldiers arrived. It contained my mother's diamonds, a few gold sovereigns, and the ruby brooch my grandmother had saved from the fire of 1812. It was all the currency I had left in the world. I did not pack a bag. I did not take clothes. I stripped off the ruined muslin dress, the white fabric stained with the dirt of the occupation, and put on a simple dark riding habit that blended with the night. I threw a heavy woolen cloak over my shoulders, pulling the hood up to obscure my face. I was shedding my skin, peeling away the layers of the mistress of Oak Alley. I left the room without looking back at the empty corner where the soldier had stood. I did not need the memory of him. I was going to find the reality. I walked out of the front door, stepping over the shattered threshold and into the cool, embracing air of the night. The moon was high and bright, illuminating the long, dusty road that led away from the estate, the same road the regiment had taken that morning. The crickets were singing, a rhythmic, pulsing chorus that sounded like a heartbeat. I did not look at the fresh grave of the rose garden or the charred remains of the barn. I looked only at the road. I knew which way they had gone. An army leaves a scar on the land that is easy to follow: rutted tracks, discarded equipment, the trampled earth. I began to walk. My boots kicked up little clouds of dust that glowed in the moonlight. I was walking away from my name, from my race, from every law of God and man that had governed my existence. I was walking into the void, a woman alone in a country at war, hunting for a ghost in a blue uniform. The fear that should have paralyzed me was gone, burned away by the revelation of the last 3 days. I had seen the face of true power, and it wasn't in the laws of the Confederacy or the social registry of the South. It was in the strength of the man who had taken my house and then protected it. I walked faster, my stride lengthening. I would find him. I would walk until the soles of my boots wore through, until I found the campfires of the Union Army. I would offer myself to him not as a lady, but as a shadow, a willing possession. I would cook for him, clean for him, lie on the ground beside him, anything to be near that source of strength again. I had poisoned the weak to follow the strong. I was voluntarily descending into the darkness, leaving the pedestal to crawl in the mud, because I knew now that the pedestal was a lie, and the mud was the only place where life, real, raw, terrifying life, truly existed.